Somewhere on the island of Crete, beneath layers of reconstruction and interpretation, the ruins of a civilization are still waiting to be properly understood. The Palace of Knossos. Frescoes of bull leapers frozen mid-flight. Octopuses painted across ceramic with an accuracy that suggests genuine familiarity. A world so visually distinctive it resembles nothing else in the ancient Mediterranean. For over a century, the question of who actually built it generated arguments that filled academic journals without ever producing a consensus. The Minoans left no decipherable written language, no named kings, no clear origin story. Arthur Evans reconstructed their world from fragments, and in doing so, shaped every assumption that followed. But Evans was working from what he could see. Nobody thought to ask what the biology said. When geneticists finally sequenced Minoan DNA, the answer did not confirm any existing theory. It contradicted the dominant one entirely. The problem with Minoan scholarship was never a shortage of theories. It was a shortage of evidence capable of settling them. For more than a century, everything written about the Minoans rested on two foundations: what archaeologists could dig up and what they chose to make of it. The second part of that equation turned out to matter enormously. Arthur Evans arrived at Knossos in 1900 and spent the next 3 decades reconstructing a civilization from its ruins. His work was genuinely extraordinary. It was also, in ways that took decades to fully reckon with, deeply shaped by what Evans wanted to find. He reassembled fractured fresco fragments into a priest king. He combined pieces from 3 separate figures to create a single iconic image that appeared in textbooks for generations. He developed a thesis built around a dominant mother goddess and its male consort, a narrative so compelling it became the default framework for Minoan religious interpretation almost immediately. The problem was that the evidence, examined more carefully by later scholars, did not cleanly support it. The reconstructions were speculative. The priest king fresco is now widely considered an assemblage rather than a portrait. The mother goddess thesis has given way to something considerably more complicated. What Evans left behind was not just an excavation. It was a set of assumptions so deeply embedded in the field that questioning them required dismantling the intellectual architecture of an entire discipline. Linear A, the Minoan writing system, remained undeciphered. No Minoan ruler has ever been identified by name. The political structure of the palace societies is still debated. The Minoans were, in a very real sense, whatever the scholar studying them decided they were. 3 origin theories dominated the pre-DNA debate. The first positioned the Minoans as an indigenous development, a Neolithic Cretan population that had simply evolved in place into something extraordinary. The second argued for North African or Egyptian origins, pointing to artistic similarities and geographic proximity across the southern Mediterranean. The third proposed Anatolian or Levantine roots, connecting the Minoans to the broader agricultural migrations that had seeded farming cultures across the ancient Near East. Each theory had its advocates. Each had its supporting material. None had the biological evidence to settle the argument. That absence mattered more than anyone fully acknowledged at the time. The debate was loud precisely because nothing existed that could end it. The evidence that ended the debate came from a cave on the Lassithi Plateau in eastern Crete. Skeletal remains from 37 Minoan individuals, preserved well enough to yield usable genetic material, were sequenced by a team led by George Stamatoianopoulos of the University of Washington, with Jeffrey Hughey as first author, and published in Nature Communications in 2013. The study compared Minoan mitochondrial DNA against 135 modern and ancient populations from across Europe, Africa, and the Near East. The goal was straightforward: find the closest living and ancient relatives of the people who built Knossos and determine where they actually came from. The North African theory did not survive the first round of results. The genetic distance between the Minoan samples and populations from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa was substantial and consistent. There was no signal pointing south across the Mediterranean. the Egypt and North Africa origin hypothesis, which had circulated in various forms for decades, was eliminated cleanly by the data. What the data showed instead was a pattern pointing northeast. The Minoans were genetically closest to Neolithic European populations and to ancient farmers from Anatolia, not modern Turks, not contemporary populations from the region. Ancient Anatolian agricultural communities, people associated with the westward spread of early farming that had moved out of Anatolia and into Europe beginning around 7000 BC. The Minoans shared their deepest ancestry with the populations that had carried farming westward across the ancient world thousands of years before the palace at Knossos was built. A subsequent genome-wide study published in Nature in 2017 reinforced this picture with considerably more resolution. Shared ancestry with populations from Anatolia, the Aegean, and southwestern Turkey emerged not as a marginal signal at the edge of statistical significance, but as a clear and consistent pattern running through the data. Nuclear DNA, inherited from both parents and capable of population-level analysis that mitochondrial data alone cannot deliver, confirmed what the earlier sequencing had suggested. The finding was not ambiguous. What this meant structurally was significant. The Minoans were not an isolated island anomaly. They were not a mysterious people who appeared in the Aegean from nowhere. They were part of the same broad Neolithic expansion that had seeded Europe's earliest farming cultures, connected to a wider ancient world whose genetic map looked nothing like the modern one. The mystery of Minoan origins was not solved so much as relocated. The question was no longer where they came from. It was what happened to them after. Understanding what the Anatolian connection actually means requires going back further than the Minoans themselves. Much further. To a period before Knossos, before the palaces, before any of the visual culture that made the Minoans famous, back to the populations who were already moving through the ancient Near East when all of that began. The Neolithic agricultural expansion out of Anatolia was not a single migration event. It was a prolonged process spanning thousands of years, beginning around 7000 BC and moving populations steadily westward into Greece and eventually across Europe. These were farming communities carrying wheat, barley, domesticated animals, and pottery traditions into territories where hunter-gatherers had lived for tens of thousands of years. They did not replace those populations entirely. They mixed with them, absorbed them, and were absorbed in return. But their genetic signature was distinct, and it persisted. It shows up in the earliest European farmers across the continent. It shows up in the Minoans. The Levantine dimension of this story adds another layer. Research into Chalcolithic populations from the ancient Near East has documented something that the Minoan data fits inside rather than contradicts. A 2017 study examining skeletal remains from a burial complex at Pekian in northern Israel, a necropolis containing the remains of roughly 600 individuals from the Copper Age, the period bridging the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, recovered a genetic signature unlike anything seen in earlier or later populations from the same region. These people drew ancestry from local Levantine Neolithic groups, from Anatolian Neolithic populations, and from Chalcolithic communities in Iran. The combination was specific to a moment. It did not persist unchanged, and it carried genetic markers for light pigmentation that surprised researchers precisely because they were unexpected in that geographic context. That population dispersed. It moved. It contributed to the genetic makeup of communities across a wide region during a period when human movement through the ancient Near East was substantial. The Minoan ancestral substrate connects to this same broader pattern. The people who eventually settled Crete and built its palace civilization were not descended from a single founding migration. They carried the accumulated genetic heritage of populations that had been moving, mixing, and settling across the ancient Near East for millennia before the Bronze Age began. The ancient world was more connected than the modern map suggests. The genetic evidence keeps confirming this. The Minoans were not separate from that world. They were a product of it, shaped by the same deep currents of population movement that were reshaping human genetics across the entire region simultaneously. The Minoan genetic signature does not map cleanly onto any living population. That is not a minor technical detail. It is the finding that places the Minoans inside a pattern that keeps appearing wherever ancient DNA reaches far enough back into the record. Modern Cretans are not the Minoans. That needs to be stated directly. The island has been settled, invaded, administered, and transformed by successive populations across 3,000 years. Mycenaean Greeks arrived and became politically dominant before the Bronze Age ended. Romans followed, Byzantines, Arabs, Venetians, Ottomans. Each wave left a genetic contribution layered on top of what came before. The Minoan signal is still detectable in modern Cretan DNA, but it is diluted, transformed, and partially obscured by everything that came after. The people who painted the bull-leaping frescoes and traded ceramic across the eastern Mediterranean are not the ancestors of modern Cretans in any simple or direct sense. This is the same finding that emerged from the ancient Egyptian data. The population that built the temples and produced Ramesses and Akhenaten was genetically distinct from the Egyptians living along the Nile today. Something changed. The ancient population and the modern population occupying the same geography are not the same population. The Minoans are another instance of that pattern. The Libyan case extends it further. The Takrkori mummies, recovered from a rock shelter in southwestern Libya and dated to 7,000 years ago, belong to a lineage documented nowhere else on Earth. Not in any living person, not in any previously recovered ancient genome. A population isolated for 50,000 years, culturally engaged with the world around them and genetically sealed from it, gone without leaving a clean trace. The Americas told the same story at a different scale. 84 distinct pre-Columbian maternal lineages, representing the full genetic diversity of ancient populations before European contact. Not one survives in any living person today. 3 continents, different timescales, different causes, the same result. Populations alive for millennia, coherent and culturally distinct, absorbed or erased without leaving a direct genetic trace in the people who came after them. Culture traveled. Genes did not always follow. The Minoans belong to this pattern, a population whose genetic identity has no clean match in the present, whose closest living relatives are distant, diluted, and transformed. The survivors wrote the history. The Minoans did not get to. The Mycenaean arrival on Crete did not announce itself as a conquest. That is what makes it difficult to see clearly in the archaeological record and considerably more interesting than a straightforward invasion story would be. What the evidence shows is a gradual process. Mycenaean cultural influence preceded Mycenaean political dominance by generations. Mainland Greek pottery styles appeared on Crete before mainland Greek administrators took control of the palace at Knossos. The cultural infiltration came first. The political reality followed. By around 1450 BC, Linear B, an early form of Greek, had replaced Linear A as the administrative language of Knossos. The palace that Evans excavated and reconstructed, the one that became the defining image of Minoan civilization in the popular imagination, was by its final phase a Mycenaean administrative center operating on Cretan soil. What this meant genetically was a layering. The Minoan population did not vanish. It was absorbed. Mycenaean Greeks became the ruling class. Minoan cultural practices persisted underneath, visible in religious iconography, in artistic traditions, in the continuation of specifically Cretan ritual sites. The population that had built the palatial civilization endured in some form, but the genetic signal they carried was increasingly mixed with Mycenaean ancestry in proportions that shifted across locations and generations. Then the Bronze Age collapse arrived and removed whatever remained of the palatial structure entirely. The trade networks that had sustained Minoan wealth disintegrated. The great coastal settlements were abandoned or reduced to shadows of what they had been. The population retreated to defensible highland villages. The elaborate burial goods disappeared. The frescoes were not repainted. The administrative systems that had required linear A and then linear B ceased to function because there was no longer anything to administer at scale. What survived was fragments. Minoan religious practices absorbed into Greek mythology, possible Minoan origins for figures like Artemis, the endurance of specifically Cretan ritual traditions long after the civilization that produced them had ceased to exist as a coherent entity. Glimpses of something that was once whole, visible only in the edges of what came after. The Minoans did not end on a specific date. They faded. They were absorbed, layer by layer, until the genetic and cultural signal they carried became indistinguishable from everything that had accumulated on top of it. That is a quieter kind of disappearance than conquest. It is not a lesser one. The evidence deserves honest handling. That means saying clearly what the data shows and equally clearly what it does not. The 2013 study drew its samples from cave burials on the Lassithi Plateau in eastern Crete. One region, one burial context. Crete is not a small or homogeneous island. It stretches 160 miles from east to west and hosted distinct regional cultures throughout the Minoan period. Knossos was not Phaistos. Phaistos was not Zakros. Whether the Lassithi population accurately represents the full genetic diversity of Minoan civilization across its entire geographic and temporal range is a question the data itself cannot answer. The study was rigorous. The methodology was sound. The sample was limited. Both things are true simultaneously. The temporal problem is equally significant. The cave burials used in the sequencing date to the Minoan palatial period, but Minoan civilization did not begin with the palaces. The pre-palatial period, the centuries of population growth and social development that preceded the great palace complexes, is almost entirely unsampled in the genetic record. Whether the people who built the first palaces around 1900 BC carried the same genetic signature as the cave burial population is currently unknown. That is not a minor gap. It is 2,000 years of Cretan history where the genetic record simply does not yet exist. Modern comparison databases carry their own limitations. Ancient sequences are compared against present-day populations to identify closest living relatives. Those databases remain uneven, particularly across the ancient Aegean and Anatolian regions, most relevant to the Minoan question. Populations that no longer exist as distinct communities may have carried genetic signatures that would shift the picture considerably if they were included. Absence of a match in a database is not the same as absence of a match in the world. What is not in dispute is the core finding. The Minoans were not of North African origin. They were not genetically isolated from the broader ancient Near Eastern world. The data opened the door. It did not walk through it. Return to Knossos, the frescoes. The bull leapers caught mid-air in paint that has outlasted the civilization that produced it. The unanswered questions Evans left behind when he put the fragments back together and called it a civilization. The DNA did not decode linear A. It did not name the rulers. It did not explain why the palaces were abandoned or what the bull leaping actually meant to the people performing it. What it did was simpler and more fundamental. It placed the Minoans inside a story already being told across the ancient world. People who came from somewhere specific, built something extraordinary, and were then absorbed so completely that their genetic signature survives only in fragments. Pre-palatal Crete remains almost entirely dark in the genetic record. Every blank space is a potential ghost. The Minoans have been waiting 3,000 years for someone to ask the right questions. The DNA opened the door. What is behind it will take considerably longer to see.